The containment alarm had been silent for 11 years when it screamed to life at 0300 hours. Commander Jonah Varel was already moving before his eyes were fully open, boots hitting the cold floor of the Ember Station barracks with practiced precision. Around him, the other Royal Guard member stirred, but Jonah was already through the door, his hand on the plasma baton at his hip, his mind cycling through threat protocols before his body had fully woken. The station was a fortress carved into the dark side of Keretha's third moon, a posting most humans considered a dead end. Jonah had chosen it deliberately. After 8 years fighting in the frontier wars, after watching half his platoon burn on the plains of Vossel 4, he'd wanted somewhere quiet. Somewhere where the biggest threat was boredom. The alarm changed that in 2 seconds flat. He reached the royal corridor in 40 steps. The hallway was long and bone white, lit by bioluminescent panels that pulsed a deep, warning crimson. For Kerethi guards stood frozen outside the sealed chamber at the far end, massive insectoid figures, their chitinous armor rattling faintly with something Jonah had never seen in them before. Fear. Report, he said, keeping his voice flat and low. Shouting wasted time. The nearest Kerethi, Sub-Commander Vreth, turned 3 of her 6 eyes toward him. The Unbound One has broken containment. She is inside the reliquary. Jonah's hand tightened on the baton. The Unbound One. He'd heard the whispers since he arrived, a name spoken only in clipped, embarrassed tones among the Kerethi staff. He'd never been given a formal briefing. He'd assumed it was a prisoner. Or a weapon. He stepped past Vreth toward the sealed door. Commander Vol. Vretha's voice dropped so low it was nearly subsonic. You do not understand what she is. Then, brief me while I move. Vretha's mandibles clicked, the Kerethi equivalent of a pained exhale. She is the 7th daughter of the Queen Empress Sorath of the Kereth Dominion. Born during a solar inversion. The priests declared her unmarked by the gods. No resonance. No hive song. She cannot feel the collective mind of our people. She cannot be felt by them. A pause that carried the weight of a culture's shame. She has been kept here since birth. Jonah stopped walking. He turned slowly and looked at Vreth. How old is she? 11 cycles of Keretha's primary star. 11 years. The alarm had been silent for 11 years because the girl had been silent for 11 years. An 11-year-old child, locked in a chamber on the dark side of a moon, because she was born wrong by the standards of her species. He turned back to the door and kept moving. The reliquary contains items of significant cultural and spiritual power, Vreth continued, hurrying to keep pace. If she damages them, the political consequence is secondary to the child's safety, Jonah said, and he said it the way he said everything, without heat, without apology, with the kind of calm that told people he had already made his decision and was simply informing them of it. Vreth went silent. Jonah placed his hand on the biometric panel. As a Royal Guard commander, he had access to every room on the station except the Queen Empress's personal chambers. The door recognized him and sighed open. The reliquary was vast and dark, its ceiling lost in shadow. Glass cases lined every wall, filled with artifacts that glowed softly in blues and golds. Kerethi history made physical, sacred objects stretching back thousands of years. The air smelled of mineral dust and something older, something that Jonah's human senses couldn't name but registered as ancient. In the center of the room, a small figure crouched behind a display case, pressing her back against it, her 4 arms wrapped around her knees. She was small for a Kerethi child, narrower than she should have been, her exoskeleton a dull, muted grey rather than the iridescent blacks and greens of the guards outside. Her compound eyes, when they found his face in the dark, were a pale, washed-out amber that the Kerethi considered a bad omen. She looked at him the way every cornered creature looked at the thing that had found it. Like she already knew what came next. Jonah stopped 6 feet away. He lowered himself slowly until he was sitting on the floor, legs crossed, baton still on his hip but his hands resting open and visible on his knees. He said nothing. He simply sat there, at her level, in the dark, and waited. The girl's 4 arms tightened around her knees. Then, in halting, careful standard, the trade language she should not have known at all, she said, "Are you going to take me back?" Jonah looked at her for a long moment. "Not yet," he said. "I thought I'd sit here for a while first." Her pale amber eyes searched his face, looking for the lie. She didn't find one. "Why?" she asked. "Because you've been sitting alone for 11 years. he said quietly. A few more minutes won't hurt anyone. Her name, he learned over the next 3 nights, was Seraphel, a designation that meant, roughly translated, the silent error. The Kerathai had given it to her without apparent cruelty. It was simply what she was to them, a malfunction, a gap in the hive song where a voice should have been. She had taught herself standard from intercepted communications she shouldn't have been able to access, using a cracked relay panel that the maintenance staff had never noticed because no one checked her room for anything other than continued breathing. She had been reading station logs, news transmissions, fragments of human entertainment broadcasts, for 6 years. She knew more about human culture than most Kerathai diplomats. She knew almost nothing about how to speak to another person. Jonah made it a habit to stop by her chamber after his evening patrol. He never brought gifts. He never performed cheerfulness. He simply came, sat on the floor on his side of the reinforced barrier, and talked, or didn't. He told her about the frontier wars in the same calm, direct way he did everything, not sanitizing it, not dramatizing it. He told her about Earth, about rain, about the way coffee smelled at 0400 hours when the rest of the world was still asleep. She listened with absolute, motionless focus. The Kerathai were not demonstrative beings. Their emotions moved through the hive song, felt rather than shown. Seraphel had no hive song, but she had learned to hold herself very still when something mattered to her. Jonah learned to read the stillness. On the 4th night, she said, "My mother is coming." Jonah kept his expression neutral. Queen Empress Seraph. She comes every 3 years. She stands outside my chamber and looks at me through the panel for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. She has never spoken. Seraphel's pale eyes were fixed on the middle distance. I have counted. Every time. 4 minutes. 40 seconds. The precision of it, the years of counting, the child reducing her mother's visits to Data because Data was the only thing she could hold, hit Jonah somewhere between his ribs with a force he didn't let reach his face. When does she arrive? He asked. 6 days. He nodded slowly. Are you afraid? Seraphel considered this with the seriousness she gave everything. I do not know what I am afraid of more. That she will look at me the same way. Or differently. Jonah understood that. He'd felt it himself, standing over the graves of his platoon, not knowing if he wanted the grief to change or stay, because at least grief was familiar. He didn't say any of this. He just nodded. She watched him nod and seemed to find something in it. On the 5th day, Vreth pulled Jonah aside in the corridor and spoke in the low, controlled tone that passed for urgency among the Kerathai officers. The Queen Empress's advance delegation has arrived. They have made a formal inquiry regarding your access to the Unbound One's chamber. I'm the commander of her security detail, Jonah said. She does not have a security detail. She has a containment protocol. She had an 11-year-old girl in an unsecured reliquary at 0300 hours, Jonah said. I'm addressing the security gap. Vretha's mandibles moved. She was not agreeing with him. She was not disagreeing. She was doing the Kerathai equivalent of choosing her battles. The Advanced Delegation Security Chief, Commander Drethfel, has requested a briefing. Schedule it. I'll attend. The briefing was not a briefing. It was an assessment. Drethfel was older than any Kerathai Jonah had worked with, his exoskeleton so dark it absorbed light, his movements carrying the absolute economy of someone who had spent a century deciding where violence was and was not necessary. He looked at Jonah the way Jonah looked at everything, like he was cataloguing it for later use. You have taken an interest in the error child, Drethfel said. Not an accusation. A notation. I've taken an interest in station security, Jonah said. The distinction you are attempting to create does not exist. Drethfel's compound eyes held steady on him. Be aware, Commander Varel, that the Queen Empress's decisions regarding her 7th daughter are not within the purview of human Royal Guard protocol. I understand, Jonah said. He meant, I heard you. He did not mean, I agree. Drethvel heard the difference. His mandibles closed with a soft, final click. You have a strange face for a guard, he said. Most humans assigned to Kerathai royal postings carry the expression of men who wish they were elsewhere. I'm where I chose to be, Jonah said. Drethvel studied him for 3 more seconds, then turned and left without another word. Jonah went back to his patrol and said nothing to anyone. But that night, When he sat down on his side of the barrier, Seraph was already there, already waiting, her pale eyes holding something she hadn't let herself of before. Something that looked, very carefully, like hope. The Queen Empress arrived on the 6th day at 1400 hours, and Ember Station changed in the way that all places changed when enormous power entered them, not loudly, but completely. The air pressure seemed to shift. The Kerathai staff moved differently, every motion more deliberate, every posture more exact. Even the bioluminescent panels along the corridor brightened by a fraction, as though the station itself was trying to impress her. Jonah stood at attention in the welcoming formation as Queen Empress Sorath of the Kerath Dominion walked through the main gate. She was taller than any Kerathai he'd seen, nearly 3 meters, her exoskeleton a deep, living black that shimmered with shifting colors like oil on water. 4 of her 6 arms were folded in the formal position of interstellar royalty. The lower 2 held the trailing edge of a cloak made from some material that absorbed light and held it, releasing it slowly, so that she seemed to carry her own private dusk wherever she walked. Her compound eyes were ancient gold. She moved without urgency and, without hesitation, which Jonah recognized as the walk of someone for whom those 2 words had no meaning. She did not look at him as she passed. He had not expected her to. The formal reception lasted 2 hours. Jonah stood where he was posted, watched the room the way he always watched rooms, and catalogued details the way his training had made instinctive. Exits, angles, which of the advanced delegation carried concealed weapons, which of them watched the Queen Empress and which watched the doors. He noted that Drethfel watched Jonah specifically, with the patient attention of someone waiting to see which way a variable would fall. When the formal proceedings concluded and the Queen Empress withdrew to her chambers, the station exhaled. Jonah completed his patrol and went to Seraphel's chamber. She was standing this time, which she never did. Standing close to the barrier, her 4 arms pressed flat against her sides in a posture he hadn't seen before. Her pale eyes were very wide. "She is here," Seraphel said. "Yes," Jonah said. He sat down anyway. After a moment, she sat too. "Will she come tonight?" "I don't know. She usually comes on the 2nd day." A pause. "But her visits have become shorter each time. 3 years ago, 4 minutes, 40 seconds. 6 years ago, 7 minutes. 9 years ago, she stopped. Something moved behind her eyes that she didn't have a word for. What happened 9 years ago?" Jonah asked quietly. "She spoke," Seraphel said. "Once. She said my designation. That was all." The pale amber eyes found his. "I have tried to determine if that was better or worse than silence. I cannot decide." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said, "It's both. That's why you can't decide." Seraphel looked at him. She held the stillness that meant something mattered. "You understand this? I've had people in my life who spoke when they should have stayed and stayed when they should have spoken," he said. "It's both things at once. That's what makes it hard." She held his gaze for longer than she usually permitted herself. Then, she said, quietly, "You have not told me why you sit with me." He had been waiting for this question. He'd known it would come. He'd spent the 6 days since her first morning deciding what the true answer was, because she deserved the true answer, not the comfortable one. "Because you exist," he said. And no one was acknowledging that. The silence that followed was the most significant silence Jonah had experienced in 11 years of professional silence reading. Then, from the other end of the corridor, came the sound of footsteps. Measured. Heavy. Inevitable. Jonah rose to his feet and turned. Queen Empress Sorath stood at the far end of the hall, alone, without escort, which was either a demonstration of absolute confidence in her safety or something else entirely. Her ancient gold eyes moved from Jonah to the barrier behind him and to the small, still figure visible through the reinforced panel. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, her eyes moved to Jonah and stayed there, and they contained a question she had not chosen to voice. He met her gaze and held it with the same calm he held everything, not defiant, not submissive. "Present. You are the human commander," she said. Her standard was perfect, which surprised him and which she saw surprise him, and which she chose not to explain. "Yes, Your Eminence," he said. "You visit her." Not a question. Information she already held, now placed between them to see what he would do with it. "I do," he said. Her compound eyes held his for 3 full seconds, an eternity in Karathai communication, where most exchanges concluded in fractions. Why? Jonah could have said, security protocol. He could have said, containment review. Every answer that would have closed the conversation safely existed in the space between that question and his response, and he let them all pass. Because she's worth visiting, he said. The Queen Empress was silent for so long that the corridor lights cycled through a full ambient pulse and returned to baseline. Then she stepped forward, and Jonah stepped aside, and she stood before the barrier and looked through it at her daughter. Seraph stood on the other side, small and still and grey and perfect in her stillness, and she did not count seconds. She simply looked back. For the first time in 11 years, the Queen Empress raised one of her hands and pressed it flat against the barrier. And, after a pause that held every year of silence between them, Seraph raised one of her own small hands and pressed it to the other side. Jonah watched, and said nothing, and understood that the thing he had carried into this posting without knowing he carried it, the belief that presence itself was an act of love, had just crossed a species boundary and landed in the most fortified, grief-sealed heart in the Kereth Dominion. The political firestorm started at 0600 the next morning. Drethvel summoned Jonah before the Queen Empress's full advisory council. 12 senior Karathai officials arranged in the semicircular configuration reserved for formal censure proceedings. Jonah walked in without hurrying and stood where they directed him with the same unhurried calm, and read the room in under 4 seconds. This was not an inquiry. It was a warning wrapped in procedure. Drethvel spoke for 8 minutes in formal Karathai, which was then translated by a junior diplomat who had the uncomfortable job of making bureaucratic condemnation sound like neutral information. The summary was this: Jonah had exceeded his mandate. His unauthorized social contact with a member of the royal bloodline, regardless of her designation, constituted interference in Karathai internal affairs. His contract with the Royal Guard was subject to immediate review. His posting could be terminated. Jonah listened to all of it. Then, he said, the girl taught herself 6 years of standard from intercepted station communications. She understood every word of this proceeding before your translator finished the first sentence. The council chamber went very still. She is 11 years old, Jonah continued. She has a mind precise enough to teach itself a foreign language through fragments, patient enough to count her mother's visits to the second for 9 years, and disciplined enough to break containment and re-enter confinement without causing damage to a single artifact. You've been calling her an error. He paused. I've been calling her exceptional. He had prepared for this moment. He had known since the morning after the reliquary that this moment would come, and he had decided what he would spend on it. I submitted my formal report to Galactic Accord Oversight at 0400 this morning, he said. It documents Seraphel's conditions of confinement, her age at time of initial containment, and the absence of any judicial or medical review of her status. Galactic Accord Protocol 7 requires a competency and welfare review for any sentient minor held in isolation exceeding 30 standard cycles. He looked at Drethvel. She has been held for 133. The silence in the chamber was a different kind now. Not the silence of control. The silence of consequences arriving. Drethvel's ancient eyes held a calculation Jonah could not fully read. The other council members communicated in the hive song, which meant a conversation was happening at a frequency Jonah could not hear and could not interrupt. He stood in the middle of it and waited. It was the Queen Empress who ended it. She entered from the rear of the chamber without announcement, which meant everyone in the room had known she was there before Jonah did, and no one had told him. She crossed to the center of the formation and stopped, and the council's hive communication ceased between one breath and the next. Leave us, she said, and 12 senior officials filed out with the speed of people who had been given exactly one option. Drethvel was last. He paused beside Jonah and said, very quietly, in standard, "You have no concept of what you have set in motion." He did not sound angry. He sounded almost awed. Then he was gone. Jonah and the Queen Empress stood alone in a room built to hold the weight of empire. "You filed the report before this meeting," she said. "Yes." "You knew this meeting was coming." "Yes." "You did it anyway." "Yes." Her ancient gold eyes moved over his face with a slowness that was not discomfort. It was examination. "Why?" she asked again, the same word she'd used in the corridor, But a different question entirely. Because she matters, Jonah said. Not politically. Not strategically. She matters because she is a person, and she has been alone since birth, and that is a wrong I am able to partially address and therefore am obligated to try. He held her gaze. That's the whole reason. There isn't another one. The Queen Empress was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way Jonah could feel before he could name. Something compressed inside it had shifted, released fractionally, like a door unsealing. The priest said she was empty, the Queen Empress said. That is what they told me in the first hour. Empty. No hive song.
No resonance.
A vessel without the divine spark of collective being. A pause. I believe them because I could not feel her. My own daughter. And I could not feel her in the song. Every other one of my children was present from birth, woven into the collective, part of my awareness. She was. The ancient voice searched for the word and could not find one adequate to the grief. Absent. She's not absent, Jonah said quietly. She's just on a frequency you don't have the instrument for. The Queen Empress looked at him for a very long time. Something moved in her ancient eyes that was not quite what Jonah would have called tears. Karathai physiology didn't accommodate them, but was the biological equivalent of the pressure that preceded them. She pressed her hand to the barrier, the Queen Empress said. She did. She has never. A pause. A breath that carried the weight of 11 years. She has never reached toward me before. She learned the gesture from watching humans, Jonah said. She watched our communications long enough to understand that reaching towards something you want is permitted. That it's not a weakness. He met her eyes steadily. No one taught her that among her own people. The silence that followed was the longest of Jonah's life. He stood in it without flinching, because he had made his decision and spent everything he had to spend on it, and what happened next was no longer in his hands. The Queen Empress of the Kereth Dominion, ruler of 11 systems, commander of the most powerful fleet in the outer reaches, closed all 6 of her eyes. When she opened them, she said, I would like you to accompany me to my daughter's chamber. Jonah said, yes. They walked the corridor together, and he stood aside when they reached the barrier, and Serethvel was standing there already, as though she had known, or hoped, or allowed herself for the first time in 11 years to want something enough to wait for it in the place where it might arrive. The Queen Empress pressed the release on the barrier herself. The panel slid back. Serethvel stood in the open space that had been sealed her entire life and did not move and did not speak, her pale amber eyes wide, her forearms pressed to her sides, waiting to find out if this too would end in 4 minutes and 40 seconds of silence. The Queen Empress crossed the threshold. She crossed the threshold, and she lowered herself, all 3 meters of ancient power and grief and terrible love, until she was at her daughter's level, and she placed one enormous hand gently on the top of Serethvel's head. And Serethvel, who had no hive song, who had never been felt in the collective, who had been called empty and silent and error for every year of her life, brought all 4 of her small arms up and held on with the desperate, precise grip of someone who had been counting seconds for a very long time and had finally, lost count. Jonah turned away, because some things were not his to witness. He walked back down the bone-white corridor, past the pulsing bioluminescent panels, past the place where Drethvel stood motionless in the shadow of a doorway, watching him with those ancient eyes that held their calculation and something new now, something that might, in a different species, have been called respect. He reached the end of the corridor and stopped. From behind him, back in the chamber where an empire was quietly rewriting itself around a single gesture, he heard a sound he had never heard from a Karathai before, low, resonant, complex, like a chord played on an instrument he had no name for. He didn't know what it meant, but it sounded like something beginning. He stood there in the quiet of the corridor and breathed the old mineral air of the station and let himself, just for a moment, feel the weight of what it cost to show up without armor in a world that didn't expect it from you, and the strange, solid thing that remained when you spent everything you had on the right choice and found it was enough. His comm unit chimed. Patrol rotation in 7 minutes. He straightened, settled his baton at his hip, and walked back toward duty with the same unhurried steps he'd carried since he arrived. The steps of a man who had chosen exactly where he stood, and would choose it again, and again, and again, until the silence around him had no room left in it for anyone to be alone.